So there are a number of directions we could move in from that. I'm sure we'll see some index cards coming up our way. I think we already have some questions from the panel.
Thank you. I can't seem to get into it. So can you squeeze through? My problem.
Of course, it won't do any good to ask any of them until the respondent can sit and pay attention.
He finds it difficult being a centrist.
That's it. Once I'm in the center, I don't move. Okay.
Right.
Need what?
Would you like coffee or tea? Both. As Levy Cole said, as you mentioned. Anyhow, I want to start with a question of my own that I thought piggybacks a little bit on the connection between your talk and the interests of maybe some of us who are affiliated with the movement of humanistic Judaism. Might be thinking about the fact that you talk about the distinction between the Muslim response and sort of secular response, and it led me to think for a second about the fact that there were secular Zionist responses to the Muslim world, but those responses were not necessarily not Jewish responses, in the sense that as Israel was constructing itself as a secular state, it was doing a lot to, or there was a lot happening in terms of the construction of a secular identity that was also a Jewish identity, and certain institutions, really not even political institutions, although there were those too, but institutions that I've studied, like the music and the poetry, and I know that you've been very much aware of these too. You studied very carefully the Israeli radio in the Yishuv period and that sort of thing. And I wonder if it sort of occurred to you, as you're studying the Muslim response, that there could be religious Muslim responses and there could be secular Muslim responses, in the sense that was there any cause to consider some of the secular response to Zionism in some way fundamentally Muslim as well, and is there a distinction between the two, and does the fact that there may not be the same sort of Muslim secular institutions have anything to do maybe in your mind with the way that these responses evolved?
It's a great question. I actually don't know if I can answer it, because it might draw on expertise that I don't have, which people on this panel do. And that's why we have lots of people here to help each other, because I work on Israel. I'm not an Arabist. And what seems to me is the case that historically, I talked about how the Palestinian community during the interwar period, it wasn't quite as backward as we might think, but still, it was not like the Jewish community. The Jewish community was incredibly well mobilized and highly literate, and they established theater troops, and they had their kids in school, and they had a radio station and newspapers and everything. There was less of this among the Palestinians. And then, of course, after 1948, let's not forget that from 1948 till 1966, Israel's Arabs lived under military rule. They lived under military occupation within Israel proper. Not a whole lot of opportunity for institution building in a situation like that. They were only allowed in a history group in 1959. They lived very, very circumscribed lives. And I think that to the extent that they expressed themselves in Muslim terms, they were Muslim religious terms. And we can talk later on today, and I know tomorrow we'll be talking about various avenues of secular Muslim identity, which is fine and important. I don't think you're going to find a whole lot of that in Israel in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Contemporary Israeli-Palestinian society is very diverse, and there's going to be secular Muslims and religious Muslims and everything in between. But historically, I think we're much more likely to see the development of that kind of identity in North America than in Israel itself.
I'd like to make some comments. I am going out of this colloquium much more pessimistic than I went in. I was usually quite an optimistic guy who lived in a country with a lot of problems, problems caused by this great conflict between the West and the East, problems caused by the conflict of Palestinians and Jews. But 74 years of my life, I lived in this country, in our country, where so many contradictions were much more important than general observations. One of the important things that are missing, I think, in what people are speaking in this colloquium, and I have full confidence in what I heard till now, and therefore I'm so pessimistic. One of the most important things that we are missing is secularized Muslims. There were more and bigger protests and assemblies of secular people in Muslim countries than in Western countries. There are more secularized Muslims than Jews. You can go always to Turkey and find a country in which is not tolerant toward religion, because there are so many secular people who believed in the revolution of Atatürk. You may say this is not our concern because they are not Arabs. They are not Arabs, they are Turks. But they were Muslims. In my life in Israel, this big conflict between Islam and Judaism is not felt in a daily life, in spite of everything. There were less suicide bombs in Israel than in all the Arab countries, including Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. And those suicide bombers, suicide murderers, usually came from outside. The Palestinian population in Israel, 1.5 million people almost, there are almost no terrorist movement amongst them. There is no one there who would like to emigrate to a Palestinian Muslim state. Some of our patients in Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem are operated by surgeons who are Arabs, who graduated Hebrew University, in which there are many, many Arab students, like in Haifa, like in Tel Aviv University, in spite of the boycott of the English against our universities that they say we have apartheid. One of our students in Tmura is one of the head teachers of the Arab Jewish school in Jaffa. And when she made the Bar Mitzvah celebrations in this school, Arab students wanted to join. 50 years ago, I established the Arab Jewish Center in Haifa, the Hagefen Center, which was a center where we had Jews, we had Arabs, we had Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs. We had Jewish directors, we had Muslim directors. We built the biggest Arab library in Israel. We started there the first Arab book fair in the Middle East. This center is in operation till today and was in operation through all the wars. When Felice painted the portrait of the Mufti of Al-Aqsa, she went up with an English photographer and a nanny and a little baby. And they went into the office of the Mufti of Al-Aqsa, and all the dignitaries were sitting around, and there she prepared this portrait of his, and it was completely normal. Israel is a country of many contradictions. it doesn't correspond to all the truths, and I am not doubting the truths that we heard today about the hatred inspired by Islam to Jews in all ages and today. I think the answer is Mark Twain. Mark Twain said that the difference between fiction and reality is that only fiction has to make sense. Our reality doesn't make sense. But our reality is completely different from all the generalizations that we hear, in spite of their being truthful and based on documents.
So you can go in on the notice.
We're going to break with colloquium. Oh, I'm sorry, Jacob, please go first.
Well, if we have no time, then...
We have time? Plenty of time.
First of all, I want to thank Eric Penslar for his presentation. I'm extremely appreciative of the fact that he points out that most historians of the Arab-Israel dispute have completely neglected Islam as a major factor. And I say this because I have recently written a book with S.E. Lantrone in which Islam plays a prominent part in all of this, and hopefully it will sell 675,000 copies like Jimmy Carter's Screed and like the forthcoming volume of Walt and Mearsheimer. Lest I appeal very self-indulgent as regards these matters, I do want to make a criticism of the nature of the establishment that produces historians of the Arab-Israel conflict. And I think Derek Penslar is a particular exception, and he's always very conscious to point out that he examines the conflict from the perspective that he understands and knows so well and is linguistically trained to do, as opposed to others who assume that they can examine this conflict without Arabic on the one hand and without Hebrew on the other hand. And I should point out that the reason why we have these difficulties is that the training of historians of the Middle East today is very different than it was when I was a student before the flood. I'm referring, of course, to Noah's flood and not the Johnstown flood. There was a time when someone who wanted to know something about the history of the Middle East studied what was generally called Oriental studies. They studied everything from the ancient Near East through modern times. They studied several language systems and literatures. They developed a profound appreciation for culture. They developed a profound appreciation for reading of texts and interrogating texts and the like. And that at a critical moment in the history of American education, it was suddenly decided that one could not be a historian of the Middle East without being trained in the Department of History. And the end result is that we began to train modern Near Eastern historians in departments of history who didn't know Arabic sufficiently well, who didn't know anything about Islam, who didn't know anything about Islamic culture, but who nevertheless had the credentials to move forward within the field and take jobs at various universities teaching in these respective disciplines. And that is why we have a great deal of impoverished literature about the Arab-Israel dispute, a dispute which certainly demands a much more intensive and critical look than it presently has today. And this, of course, is only expanded by the regular talking heads on television and on radio, former colonels and majors who served in the armed forces and God knows where, who are now experts about the Middle East as well, various journalists who get their information working in and out of bars of various hotels and the like. And this passes for what is essentially expertise, and it's really quite regrettable. And I say this not because I want to sell 675,000 books, but because I really feel that the time has come to really take stock of these issues and to try and sort out the wheat from the chaff when it comes to dealing with these particular issues. It's quite important to understand that this is a very, very serious business, and it requires the attention of very serious historians like Derek Penslar and a few others who are working in the field.
Did you want to respond? I'm sorry.
675,000.
310,000 in the $375,000.
I just want to mention that my latest book, Israel in History, which is a rather dull academic book, sales went up after a crazy right-wing evangelical preacher in British Columbia sent me a death threat and posted slightly modified versions of this threat to hundreds, if not thousands, of people. I'm surprised you didn't get the email because he's sending it all over to people. And suddenly people are now buying the book. I'm going to be very disappointed. And Amazon.com is going to have a lot of returns. They're going to say, this isn't a sexy book. It's just, you know.
If you haven't arranged to write a similar review of my book,
Actually, when I got Derek's book, it came wrapped in plastic, so I couldn't return it. I wanted to mention a couple of details. On the question of, oh, I'm sorry, were you going to respond? I thought I was saying something. On the subject of the secular Muslim world, I think one of the challenges, and this is something Amir will certainly talk about with much greater expertise than anyone else on the panel, is the challenge that the Muslim world faced, and that even Jews in the Muslim world faced in the modern period, is very different. And I take this from my own family's experience of what I call laid-back Sephardic Orthodoxy, which is a little bit different from uptight Ashkenazic Orthodoxy. Now, laid-back Sephardic Orthodoxy means that if on Saturday afternoon you want to have your coffee warm, you warm it up. If you want to go to the movies, you go to the movies. Now, if you're doing anything in a communal setting, if you're participating in a wedding or a funeral or even going for a Shabbat service, it's Orthodox, because that's what the community is. And this ethos is transited into the general Israeli scene by those Israelis who themselves live very secular lives, but say the synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox. Because if they go anywhere, that's there, and they don't go because it doesn't have meaning to them. They don't like it. But if they were to go, that's the real Judaism. And so the Sephardic style Orthodoxy is a little more laid back in private behavior, but if anything is official in public, it's Orthodox. Now in Ashkenazic Orthodoxy, this is the world that Professor Lasser described in trying to find a dishwasher disposal detergent that's kosher for Passover, and in fact, it just adds layer upon layer of rule and private behavior that makes it impossible almost to live in a modern world. So this is the challenge that the Sephardic world, that the Arab world didn't really face, as a native enlightenment that produces this kind of fanatic response. The Misnagdim and the Hasidim, the Hasidic enthusiastic followers of the Baal Shem Tov, and their ultra-Orthodox also opponents, found common cause. Who did they fight against together? The Maskilim, the Enlighteners, our intellectual ancestors. They had this common cause because there was a native enlightenment to respond to, and in some ways it made their response that much more fierce, their orthodoxy that much more deeply rooted, and that much more fanatical. There wasn't a similar Haskalah in the Sephardic world. And so the response has been very different, and I think what's happening now in the Muslim world, we've seen cases of women educated in the West or respond to the provocative encounter with Western culture who are beginning to challenge issues of women in Islam, and that was one voice that someone mentioned to me. If we were to do this program again, it would have been nice to have a Muslim woman's voice as part of the panel. But that's a voice, again, that's new, that's being projected more today, and as Professor Girgis mentioned, this woman, Wafa Sultan, who's a psychologist in Los Angeles, you've probably seen footage of her on Al Jazeera television, it's been passing around. He said she can't travel in the Muslim world. It would not be safe for her to do it because of the fame and the infamy that she has received. Now, one other detail about Professor Penslar's speech. You mentioned that the Zionist founders were imagining that the Arabs under an Israeli state would be a national minority, sort of like the Jews in Poland. And I thought to myself, oh, that was successful. So I got the joke. And the last point, I want to actually borrow something I read in Professor Lasner's book, Jews and Muslims. And it's this phenomenon of projecting your own belief system onto others. Now, we've seen it with secular historians. We see it ourselves as secular people when we can't understand how someone could actually believe in religious content. And it's true. People do all over the world. They do things because they believe in them. We do too, by the way. We do things and we don't do things because we believe in certain things, as Professor Malkin said so eloquently on Friday. So the challenge is this phenomenon of projection. And in in Professor Lasser's book, he talks about how the Islamicists in Hamas have projected their religious beliefs onto the Israeli polity. And they seem to describe Israel as dominated by the rabbis. And the government is dominated by the rabbis who have a religious agenda, who impose a religious agenda. Now, there are secular Israelis who say the same thing because of coalition politics, because of the compromises that are made. But in many ways, it's a projection of their idealized state onto someone else. And so in some ways, this whole idea of the Jews wanting to rebuild the temple and to reestablish a national home over the Temple Mount seems to me, again, this kind of projection of we would love to have control over that temple. We would love to reestablish the caliphate and so on. This projection of fantasy of an Islamic empire going backwards in time, but seeing what other people are doing and projecting the same motives, even when the motives are very different.
Right, and I think we have time for a two-part audience question because I have a couple of audience members that pulled out the idea of land. So I'll ask you a question, a two-part question about land. The first one is somebody that basically highlights the idea that, or asks the question, can one say that the land is the fundamental issue in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Now, I'll skip down to the second question, which is more of a theological question along those lines, and it's the question, this comes from the last session, but we held it over. Is the notion of the Ummah, that one is traditionally or even chronically applied to land, is that in a way that Eretz Israel is land promised to the Jews, is that justified by the text of the Hebrew Bible, and what's the justification for Islamic land? Or is there, but then I want to just finish with the question from the first questioner who asks, on a practical level, is land for peace the way to resolve this problem?
That's easy. Well, I, again, don't think I'll be able to answer all of those. Those are great questions. I think the second one, in a way, is the easiest answer, which is that Islam is a deterritorialized and dechronologized, in a way, or its sense of time and space is deeply abstract. Right? The Muslim calendar is such that Ramadan, right, it's not intercalated the way that the Hebrew calendar is. You know, we know that Hanukkah comes in the winter, and we know that Pesach comes in the spring, and Ramadan can come any time of the year. And I think the same thing is true with land. Judaism is a very concrete religion. It's a religion of mitzvot. It's a religion that, in its origins, was highly territorialized, and even when the Jews went into galut, into exile, they remained attached to an ideal of land. It's a concreteness, and it has to do with the way we celebrate our festivals, our commandments, our land. I think Islam is different. There is the notion of Dar al-Islam. There is no, these are the things to which there is no limit, to quote the rabbis. Dar al-Islam can be coextensive and should be coextensive in the Islamic imagination with the world. And so it's very different. I mean, even if you accept the territorial maximalism of certain parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish polity would run from the Nile to the Euphrates. In Zionist consciousness, the revisionists talked about both banks of the Jordan, and it's amazing how quickly the revisionist Zionists gave up on that view after 1948. And we're happy with the notion of the greater Eretz Israel going out to the Jordan River. But there is this sense of kind of delimited but absolutely essential space in Judaism, and rather small space. That great Ibn Amitai line about how Israel is like a small package tied with string quite tightly, and sometimes it hurts. Islam is much more expansive. The first question, that was I think the second question, and then that was the land for peace, that. Okay, here's where I have to, like most historians, wimp out. Well, less than that because I'm going to wimp out, which is this. I'm a historian and I'm not a soothsayer. And I cannot predict if Israel does this and this, everything will be fine. And by the way, I appreciate your optimism and the things you're saying. No, seriously, because it's the way that I live my life. I mean, we do good things, and we hope that good things will come from them. The original dispute between Jews and Arabs over Palestine was a land issue. As I talked about in my remarks earlier, it was simply a question. People live here. You can live here up to a certain extent, say the Muslims, but you can't have a sovereign polity. it becomes something more than that. It becomes an Islamic dispute. It becomes tied up with anti-colonialism. And by the way, Yaakov, you're absolutely right, because a lot of secular Muslims are secularizing Muslims in Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, whatever, even Pakistan. But there's also a lot of hostility to Israel in these countries, but it could be just a generic third world anti-colonial hostility, not necessarily Muslim hostility, but the hostility is still there. And here again, I have to be anecdotal because you can easily have an expert who will tell you the problem is entirely land, and if the Israelis simply give up a whole bunch of land and they agree to a Palestinian state within pre-67 borders, that somehow everything else will magically come with itself. I'm not that sanguine. But I also, and this is where I have to resort to faith, do secular humanist Jews have faith?
That may be a future colloquium.
Right. Because it becomes a matter of faith that, in my view, land is a necessary, although possibly insufficient precondition. The land issue must be resolved. I don't know if that is enough. My own sense, and now I revert to my characteristic, rather quirky sense of humor, is that there's always going to be a certain percentage, Jews and Palestinians, Muslims, whatever, the global population, that will be unsatisfied with any kind of compromise solution to anything. And in the Palestinian territories, that percentage might be quite large. It could be 20%. Okay? But if one can win the consensus of the other 80%, that's very powerful. So my answer is, will land for peace suffice? I do not know, but I think it's a necessary precondition.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and I know you've all really enjoyed it. We're done with this session, but let's see what the great